welcome to everybody from quite an enchanting evening. I don't know whether your evening or morning or has any enchantment in terms of the light. I was out in the garden just before supper, doing a little bit of thistle duty, you might say, just the large ones, because the small ones are less than enchanting. And last year I had 3,500 of them, and I'm afraid it's about the same this year. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to have Patrick Curry with us this evening. And following my reading and reviewing of his book, Enchantment, about a year ago, I think, Wonder in Modern Life. And so he has a PhD, as you may have read, in History and Philosophy of Science from University College London, HPS as they call it, in Cambridge. And he's also, as you see, got an interest in Tolkien's fiction, ecological ethics, and astrology, science and culture, which I see he edited with Roy Willis, who I don't know whether he's still with us, but he was a member and quite active at some point. And he's also editor of Divination, Perspectives for a New Millennium. And so there's a lot that we could be going into this evening, and we'll be sending off, obviously, details, follow-up details to that. So what's going to happen is that Patrick's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to go into some enchanting breakout rooms, and then we have a break, and there'll be brief notices about the network, and then time for discussion and reflection. So Patrick, over to you.
Right. Well, thank you, David, and thank you very much to everybody who's shown up for this. Very gratifying. So what I'm going to do is talk about enchantment, as my title says. I'm going to do it in this way. First, I'm going to give some examples of enchantment. Then I'm going to talk about what we can learn from them and how perhaps best to understand them. Then I'm going to discuss some implications, three in particular, that I think might be particularly relevant to the interests of members of the Scientific and Medical Network, and then finally I'll wrap up. To get started, really all you need to know about enchantment is that it is an experience of wonder, and I'll come back to that absolutely fundamental point. Right away that implies it's not an experience of will. You're just in a state of wonder or maybe awe. In fact, enchantment, experiences of enchantment vary in intensity. They can go all the way from charming, merely but nicely charming, to delight, which is sharper and keener, to full-blown joy. And that's what I call radical enchantment. That doesn't tend to happen too often in a lifetime, but when it does, it can be life-changing. So let me start with these examples. Obviously there's many examples I could draw upon, and I should say that in theory anybody or anything can enchant, but we are a particular kind of creature. So enchantment tends mostly to happen in certain contexts, and these include, for example, love, interpersonal love of all kinds, the natural world, perhaps especially wild places, relationships with other animals than ourselves, religious ritual, art of all kinds, whether it's visual, oral, three-dimensional, or literary, food and drink, which is an important but underestimated source of enchantment in our lives, learning, sports, and so on. So these three examples leave a lot out, but I think they're interesting. The first one I'm about to give you doesn't fall into actually any of those categories. It's what I call the enchantment of address or personal address, whereby a highly personal concern is inexplicably addressed by the cosmos. This happened to a very good friend of mine. On a fair day in early autumn a few years ago, this friend was walking in a London park, and she was feeling quite severely oppressed by her approaching 50th birthday, and as it seemed, old age. when she saw a bright turquoise blue balloon floating high overhead before disappearing into the distance. A while later, continuing on her walk, she noticed it again. This time it was now floating on the edge of a pond. And she was concerned that the waterfowl there, including some babies, might become entangled in the trailing string. So she got a stick and managed to retrieve it, picked it out of the pond, and turning it around, found on it the words, "Happy 50th birthday." I know this happened. So that's an example of enchantment of a dress. My second example is one of the best personal records of radical enchantment, and it's very well known already. It's that of Aldous Huxley, recalling what happened when he took mescaline on the morning of the 6th of May, 1953 in Los Angeles. I'm sure it'll be familiar to some of you, but let me remind you that what struck Huxley as he looked at some flowers in a vase was that, quote, "Plato seems to have made the grotesque mistake of separating being from becoming and identifying it with the mathematical abstraction of the idea, capital I. He could never, poor fellow, have seen a bunch of flowers shining with their own inner light, could never have perceived that what rose and iris and carnation so intensely signified was nothing more and nothing less than what they were, a transience that was yet eternal life, a perpetual perishing that it was at the same time pure being," end quote. And try and keep that somewhere in mind as well as we proceed. Finally, here's a particular favorite of mine, the poet Louis MacNeice, on a touchstone place for him, McGilligan's Strand, a beach in Ireland. I will just add parenthetically that I've found poets to be among the very best witnesses of enchantment. But here's MacNeice. "McGilligan's Strand was like falling in love. For such occasions, the word falling is right. One does not step into love any more than one steps asleep or steps awake. One falls. For awake, like asleep, is what one falls or falls into, and to keep falling awake seems to me the salt of life. We cannot, of course, live by Keats's negative capability alone. We must all, in E.M. Forster's phrase, use telegrams and anger. All the same, what I feel makes life worth living is the surrenders. It may be to the life-quickening urge of an air raid, because this was written around the time of the Second World War, to nonsense talked by one's friends, to a girl on the top of the Empire State Building, to the silence of a ruined Byzantine church, to woods or weirs, or to heat dancing on a graveled path, to music, drink, or the smell of turf smoke, to the first view of the Atlantic, or to the curve of a strand which seems to stretch to nowhere or everywhere, and to ages before and after." Now, I could give a lot more examples, but I think that'll do. You'll find more in my book if you want them. So fundamentally, enchantment is an experience, as I say, of wonder, and varies from charm, delight, to joy. Its contrary of enchantment, which partly defines it and vice versa, is will, as in, say, the will to power, or power knowledge, or any sort of agenda. Now, it's really important that enchantment is relational. It's always wonder at someone or something, or you're enchanted by someone or something. It happens as an encounter with an enchanting other across a gap of difference, which it instantly bridges. This other can be literally, as I said before, anyone or anything, certainly doesn't have to be another human being, but whatever or whoever the other turns out to be, whether another human, an animal, a place, a work of art, even an idea, they become in effect a person with a subjectivity and agency of their own. As you can imagine, this experience is very challenging to some powerful traditional, mostly religious, and modern, mostly secular, orthodoxies. So it often doesn't get talked about much in public, particularly if people are perhaps afraid of being misunderstood or even made fun of. Being relational, enchantment is ecological. That's, after all, what ecology is. It's the study of relationships between animals, including ourselves. And also, like the natural world, and this is very important, enchantment is wild. That's because in any relationship properly so called, no one party is in charge or in control. Each of the at least two parties involved affects the other in an ongoing recursive process. So enchantment, being wild, can be invited, but it cannot be ordered or controlled or managed. And when it does happen, it happens as a gift. So the best attitude to have towards it is one described by the wonderful travel writer Freya Stark as fearless receptivity. Also, by virtue of being relational, enchantment is necessarily participatory. You're in it, or else it's not happening. The etymology of the word implies as much. Enchantement, from the Old French, originally Latin, meaning to be in a song. And I think by extension, to find yourself in a narrative, a story, really of any kind. And by the same token, the natural world, which I just mentioned, includes human beings. We cannot stand entirely outside enchantment, studying it dispassionately, because if it's happening, we're part of it. Similarly, we can't stand entirely outside the entire natural world, because we're also part of that. Now, another inalienable characteristic of enchantment is that, like love, it is only forever while it lasts. Time radically slows down, and I think everybody's sometime or other had this experience. Time radically slows when it happens, may even stop for a moment, but not completely or forever. Eventually, the very slowly swirling eddy in the pool rejoins the larger, swiftly flowing stream of time, and it is swept away. For that reason, enchantment sometimes has an undertow of melancholy. It's always passing, and the fact that it always might return isn't always much consolation. And of course, being wild, you can't hang on to it because you're not in charge of it. But that passingness is inseparable from what makes enchantment precious. Its unbiddability, to use a different word, by virtue of which the enchanting other, whoever and whatever they are, is not simply an extension or a version of ourself or under our control. If it was, that would remove the whole joy of enchantment, the whole blessing of it, the whole gift. J.R.R. Tolkien, who I have found to be authoritative on this subject, describes enchantment as, quote, a love and respect for all things, whether animate or inanimate, an unpossessive love of them as other. And he asserts that it is, quote, as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for physical life, end quote. Which implies, I think, that if people can't get the real thing, they will settle for counterfeits. The parallel with food, fast food and real food, is quite exact. In this case, the fraud, the counterfeit that corresponds to enchantment is what I call glamour. It's a simulacrum of enchantment, but unlike enchantment, glamour is wholly biddable, manipulable, full of purpose. In fact, it is a multi-billion-pound industry, principally advertising, but also spin and public relations, which is essential to the operations of both capitalism and the state. And the purpose of glamour is to deceive and disenchant, so that souls starving for the real thing, to use a phrase, coined a phrase, keep coming back for more of what cannot satisfy, and of course, keep paying for it. The social philosopher Max Weber defines enchantment as concrete magic. That's a really rich term, so let me try and unpack that for you. What Weber means by that term is that enchantment is always material, even carnal, always embodied, always embedded in specific, very specific, precise circumstances. And at the same time, it is completely spiritual, deeply mysterious. It's both. That makes enchantment problematic to both of the dominant metaphysical camps of our time. On the one hand, scientific materialists, and on the other, what I'm going to call romantic supernaturalists. And much as these two parties detest each other, they are actually in tacit agreement that you can carve up the world that way and then reduce one truth to the other. The materialists are always trying to reduce the spiritual to materiality. The spiritualists are always trying to derive a material world, as Plato did, from the spiritual world or the world of ideas. Enchantment resists that whole process, either way. And when it cannot resist it, it dies. Weber put it this way: the unity of the primitive image of the world, in which everything was concrete magic, has tended to split into rational cognition and the mastery of nature on the one hand, and into mystic experiences on the other. The inexpressible contents of those mystic experiences remain the only possible beyond, which is then added to the mechanism of a world robbed of gods. In other words, the rational mastery of the sensible world, led by technoscience, abetted by the state and by capital, which is incidentally exactly the opposite of receptivity, drives out the mystery of the world, which then has nowhere left to go but to an apparently dematerialized spiritual world. Then those people who feel the loss of mystery or spirituality in the disenchanted world, then often are tempted into making the mistake of accepting this second transcendental world as something somewhere else, something else from this world. They are tempted into thinking that the spirituality of this non-concrete world must be added to the concrete world in order to make it meaningful again. And in fact, that's what the word supernatural implies. Super, above or beyond, natural, the world of nature. The problem is, this is not how to go about achieving wholeness. Because the very act of splitting the world into these two parts is, according to Weber, precisely what results in the disenchantment of the world, including ourselves. That's a process with its roots in Platonism. Plato made a very sharp distinction between the spiritual world and the material world. This was then taken up in Pauline Christianity, very, very influentially, and then supercharged for modernity by Descartes and Cartesianism, which also accepted the exact same split which left him the puzzle of how do these two worlds relate to each other. But if an understanding of enchantment can be taken as a guide in this matter, the mistake is separating the two, and I'll come back to that point. For now, I just want to emphasize that accepting that split acquiesces in disenchantment. And it's terribly easy for us to acquiesce in that sort of way, because the sort of metaphysically loaded and value-laden polarities that result from the split are so ingrained in our cultural traditions, most notably Greek and Christian. Not only are we trained, and have we been trained for so long, to think in terms of material versus spiritual, or material versus mental. And in this case, mental is a sort of secular substitute for spiritual, or body versus mind. But a whole series of associated hierarchical polarities, inner versus outer, higher versus lower, light versus dark, and not least male versus female. I'm not saying that these are all the same as each other. I'm certainly not saying that. But I'm saying that they are different qualities. They're not foundational. Okay? And the trouble with using these polarities, where one is valued more than the other, inner is better than outer, merely outer. Light is much superior to dark, and so on. The trouble with using them is that they map onto one another very easily, so that when you invoke one polarity, all the others tend to kick into play. So male has tended to be associated with light, and light with spirit or mind, and spirit or mind with higher, and higher with heaven. While female has been associated with dark, dark with the body with lower, lower with the earth, and so on. As I say, the point is not that these contrasts don't exist, but it's that their meanings are not fixed essences. They're relational, so they depend for their meanings on contrasts with other qualities, and they change according to context. In one set of circumstances, for example, darkness can be suffocating and extinguishing, but in another, it can be deeply nourishing and protective. By the same token, light can be either illuminating, enlightening, or it can be relentless and tyrannical. We know that to be kept in bright light 24/7 is a form of torture, and so on. A few other philosophers have made the same point as Weber. Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example, writes in one of his diaries, quote, "Physiological life is of course not life, and neither is psychological life. Life is the world, and the world, needless to say, includes us." Similarly, Gregory Bateson, who was one of my teachers, writes, quote, "These two species of superstition, these rival epistemologies, the supernatural and the mechanical, feed each other," end quote. Why? Because they both accept the split and then set about eliminating it by a strategy of reducing one side to the other. One side tries to explain away the spiritual is actually material, while the other tries to deduce the material world from Platonic ideas or archetypes or whatever. The result is two competing monisms. And with both of them, they both operate in a sort of circular way. Monism, whether it's spiritual or material, disenchants, perhaps not quite equally, but I'll come back to that later. How does it disenchant? In imposing a single metric, concept, and value of truth, a single kind of truth, a metric of truth and value, as a necessary preliminary to mastering the world, monism disenchants. And it does so through what Weber, I'm going back to Weber again, describes as, quote, the belief. And note that all that is required for this disenchantment is the belief, quote, that there are actually no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things through calculation. Isn't that the modern project in a nutshell? To master all things through calculation. The other half of the circle of disenchantment is because then disenchantment loses sight, and not only sight, but sound and feel and smell of the illimitable richness and plurality of lived life. That makes the reign of monism easier in turn. When relationality, on the other hand, is recognized as fundamental, monism becomes impossible. You can't sustain it. So an experience of unity is fine, absolutely fine, but not as any kind of support for positing a single truth or a single way or a complete oneness. As Bateson said, it takes two to know one. W.H. Auden, the great poet, makes the same point. For there to be one, there must first be two. And finally, the Victorian writer George MacDonald, there can be no oneness where there is only one. Why? Because nothing can be identified as anything in particular. Actually, I think nothing is anything in particular, but we don't need to go there. Nothing can be identified as anything in particular except in relation to something that it's not. In fact, to everything that it is not. So if there is oneness, there must also be something else which differs from it, which stands outside that oneness, that you can compare it to and go, ah, this is oneness. That means that the so-called oneness isn't really one, because there's something it doesn't include. So oneness in practice always fails, which is why unity or oneness, especially with a capital U or a capital O, must be and always is enforced. In the words of a modern philosopher, literary critic, Barbara Herrnstein Smith, the project that results is, quote, to identify the presumptively universally compelling truth and way, and to compel it universally, which of course can be done crudely or it can be done subtly. Writing towards the end of his life, Bateson continues in this way, from what I quoted earlier. Quote, I find myself still between the Scylla, the monster, or the whirlpool, I forget which, but one of them, of established materialism with its quantitative thinking, applied science, and controlled experiments on the one side, and the Charybdis, monster or whirlpool, of romantic supernaturalism on the other hand. My task is to explore whether there is a sane and valid place somewhere between these two nightmares of nonsense. More recently, David Abram, in The Spell of the Sensuous, made just the same point. He criticized both scientific discourse, which privileges abstract objectivity, and what he called New Age discourse, which privileges subjectivity. Each view, he says, quote, bolsters the other, and by bouncing from one to the other, from scientific determinism to spiritual idealism and back again, it's easy to avoid the possibility that the perceiver and the perceived are interdependent, and in some sense, even reversible aspects of a common, a shared animate nature that is what at once both sensible, that is objective, and sensitive, subjective. Well, this is concrete magic. Describing experiences such as deep enchantment, the phenomenologist Henri Boertoft writes that, quote, far from being just a subjective experience, and I might add, far from being a psychological experience, this, as it might be enchantment, is a non-Cartesian event which happens upstream before the separation into subject and object. I love that metaphor, upstream of the separation into subject and object. So I would advise you not to accept any analyses of wonder as a psychological event or a subjective event, any more than you should accept ones which reduce it to neurophysiology. Both of them have already killed the living subject before even starting by turning it into a pure object. The broader and deeper point here is that enchantment as an experience of the wonder of life reminds us precisely that life is both subjective and spiritual and objective or material, plus all of their associated qualities. For that reason, I don't think it's quite right to describe it as a kind of mystical experience, if what is meant by that term is something wholly ineffable, wholly transcendent, without any reference to circumstances. As concrete magic, enchantment is always very precisely situated, embedded, and embodied as this person, in this place, at this moment. Nor is it transcendent in the usual sense of rising above the spiritual world or leaving it behind, nor is it supernatural for exactly the same reason. The magic part of enchantment is not a beyond located elsewhere. Rather, it is in the circumstances, deep in the circumstances. It's not, as another philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, puts it, the contrary of the sensible, but its lining and depth. To put the matter another way, the transcendence of enchantment is immanent. It is not before or after, above or beyond life, but it is in and as life. And the farther in you go, the bigger and deeper and more mysterious it gets. So let me turn to some of I mentioned the implications that I thought would interest you. As I see it, there are at least three. One I've already mentioned, but I'll come back to it again because I don't know about anybody else, but it took me a while to get my head around it. So the first implication is that uncritical calls for unity and proclamations of oneness, perhaps with a capital O, are unsustainable and should be avoided. Why? Because of the relationality. And I quoted Bateson, it takes two to know one. W.H. Auden, for there to be one, there first must be two. In other words, if you have an experience of oneness or unity, it's going to be an experience of unity with somebody or something who isn't you. Otherwise, it's pure solipsism, isn't it? So if your experience of oneness or unity is with another or others, that's a plurality by definition. There's more than one. Then you can have an experience of oneness, and only then. As I said earlier, I'm not denying the possibility of experiences of oneness or unity at all, okay? But I am advising caution in jumping from such experiences to inferring an apparently objective or universal truth like all is one. Right, second implication. The second implication of what I've been saying, in line with concrete magic and in line with faith suggestion that the fundamental act of disenchantment is split concrete magic into its two parts, the concrete part, the material part, and the magic part, the spiritual or mental part. I think the implication of this is quite clear. To affirm one side or the other, and it almost doesn't matter which side you're affirming, material or spiritual, objective or subjective, simply reinforces the whole game, the whole disenchanting splitting and its destructive effects. It's not a radical move. It doesn't go to the root of the problem. In fact, if you consider disenchantment, such as the disenchantment of the world and so on, to be the problem, then accepting that split as foundational reinforces that problem. The point rather is to subvert that split. So if you really want to, for example, revolutionize the materialist paradigm, supercharging the idealist paradigm is the wrong way to go about it. What this could mean, for example, philosophically is insisting not only on the truth of panpsychism. I'm assuming you're familiar more or less with the idea of panpsychism, that there's no particle of matter which is not inhabited or accompanied or imbued with consciousness. That's fine. But also the counter-truth at the same time, that there's no form of consciousness, no matter how supreme or elevated, which is entirely immaterial. I think those two truths go together. To emphasize just one or the other is to participate, if I'm right, in disenchantment. The third implication, perhaps more problematic, perhaps even unwelcome, but that may be a bit controversial. Here's how I see it. As we've seen, enchantment and lived life, of which enchantment is a kind of intensification, is lived in the first person, I. It's inalienably personal in particular, although in a way that doesn't make it merely subjective, but in a way that opens a way into the cosmic and the universal through relationship. Okay? But modern science, from its beginnings at least 350 years ago, right up to the present, is committed to a third-person perspective. He, she, it, they. Of so-called objective and, at least in principle, publicly verifiable phenomena. The person to read about this, among many others, is Thomas Nagel in his book Mind and Cosmos. Only one of many philosophers to confirm this point. This to a third-person perspective by modern science, for example, is not something that post-quantum physics altered. Because real scientists, physicists, as opposed to science writers and popular philosophers, argued that the weirdness of post-quantum physics was confined to strictly experimental contexts. It's kind of like, oh, it's okay. All that weirdness is perfectly safe. It's nothing to worry about. It doesn't get into the macro world. Okay. The scientific ideal is a comprehensive system of true knowledge and, at least this is what they would like, a surefire method, preferably an algorithm, to bring it about. And it's this very ideal carried into domains where it's not appropriate, which opens the door to scientism. But that door is a hard one to shut because no system is comprehensive or can be comprehensive, truly comprehensive, unless it includes the person doing the systematizing, the scientist. But if you do that, you've eliminated any unmoving Archimedean point for so-called objectivity. But conversely, if your system doesn't include the observer or the theorist, then it isn't comprehensive. Furthermore, to assume any methodology any method or knowledge of method or collection of methods will ever automatically produce truth, which is what the scientific ideal posits, is the purest magical thinking. Magical not in the sense of wonder, but in the sense of magic, okay? Almost, occult magic. Why? Because a method always needs to be correctly applied. And there can be no rule telling you how to correctly apply it. Again, why? Because the meta rule also needs to be correctly applied. So you'd require a further meta rule to tell you how to do that. You end up with very quickly in an infinite regress. The need for personal judgment in science, no less than any other human activity, can never be eliminated except by bad faith. But these objections don't stop the scientific program, because as philosophers like Paul Feyerabend and Mary Midgley have repeatedly shown, science is essentially a faith-based enterprise. In the words of Alfred North Whitehead, quote, "Science repudiates philosophy. It has never sought to justify its faith." So there can't be a science in the sense of the word as it is commonly used of participatory first-person experience. Nor can there be a science, again in that sense of the word science, of wisdom, which is equally unsystematizable, relational, and contextual. The only way science can handle participatory first-person experience, including wisdom, including enchantment, is to first turn them into something else, something public, empirical, isolatable. And it seems to me that if a discourse resists that process of being converted, it will be barred from the club or ejected from the club. Isn't this more or less exactly what happened to chaos and complexity theory, to general systems theory, to Neo-Goethean phenomenology, to David Bohm's implicate order, to Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic resistance, to Michel Gauquelin's neo-astrology, and most of James Lovelock's Gaia theory? They were all rejected from the club, ejected, shown the door. I'm sorry, what you're doing is very interesting, but it's not science in the official view. Okay? In the case of Gaia theory, this effect was dampened by the fact that Lovelock was undeniably himself a scientist, although of a type which is now very nearly extinct, the maverick lone scientist. And if you can prove, a word that I would never let my students use because I don't believe that there's any such thing outside pure mathematics and logic. Nonetheless, if you could prove something which strongly contradicts current scientific knowledge, using the current version of scientific methods and methodology, that unless help arrives quickly in the form of other supporting results, scientists will simply change the rules. If they have to, they will, to keep you out. So, my impertinent advice, for which I hope you forgive me, is to accept that the scientific and medical network often uses the word science and the context and a concept of science that its official registered owners will never accept. And I don't personally expect they ever will. Let me wrap up. Earlier I mentioned panpsychism as a theory that is friendly to enchantment and wisdom and lived life, the idea that consciousness inheres in matter. But I worry that panpsychism itself comes too close to a universalist, monist, or absolutist theory, asserting that there just is such consciousness whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, and so on. All the rest of that malarkey. That's why I prefer animism, which I define as the principled habit of staying open and receptive to agency and subjectivity, no matter where, when, or in what form you encounter it. Could be a tree, could be a stone, could be a star, could be a person, could be an animal. You don't engage in modernist self-policing and go, oh, I thought that tree had something to tell me with communicating something. No, that's impossible. Trees can't do that. Therefore it didn't, and I must have imagined. Just forget all that. Why engage in that? Who benefits from it? Certainly we don't. So being open, that's what I'm calling to that sort of experience and seeing what you can learn, no matter what the source. That's what I'm calling animism, okay? And that entails being receptive to relationship. So the conditions for enchantment in animism, without any guarantee of enchantment, of course, are being met already. What this practice that I'm calling animism entails, what it both requires and produces, is not knowledge, but wisdom. I don't really think we need any more knowledge, not even spiritual knowledge, whereas we are desperate for more wisdom. Wisdom doesn't consist of propositions such as water is made up of molecules of hydrogen and oxygen, or human beings are rational maximizers of their self-interest, or indeed, human beings are not rational maximizers of their self-interest. Or life is governed by 12 or however many great spiritual principles, and so on. Wisdom consists of and works by metaphor, the realization that, oh, this is that. Classic example, of course, is Achilles is a lion with an exclamation mark, because wisdom is always a discovery, okay? The effect of metaphor here is both a discovery of something that was already true, but we didn't realize it, and that truth becoming real as a result of being discovered. Achilles always was, in some essential part of his being, a lion, but it only became true for us as a result of being discovered, which is why I want to keep the exclamation mark. And that kind of truth, let's call it metaphoric truth or whatever you want, is not merely about something or someone. It changes what the world is. In philosophical terms, the truth of metaphor, of wisdom, is not merely epistemological, a matter of pure knowing. It's ontological. It's a matter of what is. So metaphorical truth like this breaks the rules of formal logic. It's scandalous to the adherents of deductive logic, because according to them, Achilles cannot be both a man and a lion at the same time, but must be unambiguously either one or the other, and no third thing. Okay, that's expressly ruled out. But being scandalous in that sort of way is actually a small price to pay for a new and profound truth. The great physicist Niels Bohr said once, the opposite of a deep truth is not a falsehood, but another profound truth. And sometimes realizations like that are crowned with wonder. I sometimes think enchantment is almost nothing more than a message saying, wake up, pay attention, something important's going on here. Okay, I also realize that some people will find, nonetheless, even after all this, no matter how persuasive I've been, will find enchantment, understood in the way I've defined it, unsatisfactory. They will want to hold out for eternal, unchanging, universal truth, perhaps with a capital T, of the kind that Plato and St. Paul, and in his own way, Descartes, promised us. But that pursuit, it seems to me, runs a terrible risk. It's the risk of losing what is actually on offer in life, limited perhaps, but real, for a chimera, an illusion. Because personally, I think deep enchantment is as good as it gets. We should be so lucky, even. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Very wide-ranging, and I love the Bateson coming in. And for oneness, you need two, and having this inherent link. And you also reminded me of the famous Thomas Berry quote: "The world is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects."
Oh, wow. I didn't know that one. That's wonderful.
The world is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And I think David Abraham might have used that in a meeting we were at in Norway many years ago.
All right.
Which is also attended by Arnie Ness.
Ah, yes. Fantastic.
Yeah. And I've been leafing through, and maybe I'll read this towards the end, a poem by Hermann Hesse, and another one by Kathleen Raine, which I think are sort of...
Oh, good. I noticed you leaping up and grabbing things.
Looking around, not too off-putting.
There's a very important point about enchantment that I haven't mentioned that you've just reminded me of, which is that we can learn a lot from experiences of enchantment. And one of the most important things that we learn is you learn what what I would like to call the intrinsic value of the enchanting other party is. William James has this wonderful story, well, I think it's wonderful, where he says, Jack is in love with Jill. Everybody else looking at Jill sees, frankly, quite an ordinary person. But Jack doesn't see her that way at all. Then William James says, who sees Jill more truthfully? Well, obviously, Jack does. Because he's privileged to see her as she really is, her intrinsic value. The rest of us can't see that because we're not in the right frame of mind. So that's why enchantment is sort of inherently subversive, because in a world basically dominated, not entirely dominated, but largely to an uncomfortable extent dominated by capital and state and technoscience, in which the ideal condition of the world is total for these people is totally disenchanted, where everything has a money value, and therefore everything's interchangeable. Oh, if I sell this, I can buy that, and so on. Well, enchantment is very subversive from that point of view, because it says, no, the value of this person, this animal, this wild place, this meal, whatever it is, cannot be calculated. It's not that kind of value. It's intrinsic value or inherent value. So, sorry, it's not for sale. And that can create a lot of problems. So the mega machine, as I call it in my book, has a vested interest in disenchanting people and the world, because the whole thing flows more smoothly then, and you don't have these awkward people saying, no, I'm sorry, this little patch of woods is not for sale, so you can redevelop it, or whatever.
Mm.
Thank you.
Jonathan Steddall, who's on the call, has got a new book, which is, you'll have to put the name in the chat because I haven't got it with me here, but it's a retelling of the Pooh story.
Oh, wonderful.
With an action group of a motley crew of people from the village.
Good, yes.
And it's wonderful. I love it. I've read about half of it so far. But they're also trying to save the enchanted wood, you see.
Oh, good. Well, I have a lot of time for Winnie the Pooh, so I look forward to that.
Yes. Patrick, I just wanted to ask you about music.
Oh, yes.
You haven't said very much about that, but music and enchantment?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The book I'm writing at the moment now as a follow-up book to the one on enchantment published in 2019 is on art and enchantment. Obviously, I can't cover all art, so it's just about music, painting, and literature. But so music figures very largely in the work I'm doing now. It's such an important kind of enchantment. I almost don't know what to say about it or where to begin. But I will just mention that the form that enchantment takes with music very often is to feel swept away or
Mm.
swept off your
Mm.
feet, or carried away, or carried off by the music. And it's as if particularly with melody. Melody is terribly important, perhaps even more important than harmony or percussion in this context. You're following the melody. It's going somewhere. It's
Mm.
behaving like a living thing that you are somehow caught up in, and it's taking you away. Except that, again, I suspect that this taking away is not a form of, actually it feels transcendent, but it's not a form of transcendence. It's actually taking you more deeply into the moment that you're already in and the place you're already in, that you hadn't,
Yeah.
wasn't available to you before, wasn't accessible, and the music makes it, opens that door. So anyway, there's a lot to be said about music.
Thank you. I mean, my take on, or one possible take on that, is to do with the spaces in between.
Oh, absolutely.
So one example, specific example, one or two of you might possibly know it, is the C-sharp minor fugue in Book 1 of the 48, played by Rosalind Turek. And just the way that she opens the fugue, subject fugue, and the pauses between a whole universe.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
as it
But
were.
the gaps are
Gap.
terribly, terribly important. I would say that's where enchantment lives. It's the gaps between things. Yes, because without the gaps, there can be no relationship. There can be no encounter. You can't cross the bridge unless there's something there to cross. And the worrying thing about, among many other worrying things, about social media and its dominance, many good things about it as well, but they love to fill up the gaps. Social media loves to fill up the gaps. So you have no gaps left. No gaps of inattention, no gaps of being alone, no gaps where something isn't trying to get your attention, etc. And I find that quite worrying. I think it's very disenchanting.
Fragmenting.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, yes.
I was on a call a couple of nights ago with a man called Mark Link, and he said solitude is being alone done well.
Oh, that's awfully good. That's awfully good, yeah.
Who was it? It wasn't his quote, but I thought very nice. Being
very
alone,
nice, yeah.
done well.
Yeah. Without in relation to enchantment, without darkness, the light can't shine.
Exactly.
And without silence, you can't hear the sound. So these things that we're all kind of a little wary of, perhaps understandably, but they are absolutely necessary part of an all wonder, I think.
But that's been such a beautiful unfolding from what you said, Patrick. And I'm very grateful to the way that you contextualized your subject and not allowed us to split things apart in the normal way and reduce one thing to the other, but rather keep that betweenness, the space, and the togetherness and the two-ness that we need for that experience of oneness, which is very beautiful, very beautiful.
Thank you.
So if I may, I'm going to finish with these two poems by Hermann Hesse and Kathleen Raine as a kind of envoi, as they say. Somebody says, what about jokes? Yes, jokes, wonder jokes. I don't know whether you can think of any. Anyway, this is Hermann Hesse, Die ersten Blumen in German, the first flowers. Beside the brook, towards the willows, during these days, so many yellow flowers have opened their eyes into gold. I've long since lost my innocence, yet a memory touches my depth, the golden hours of morning, and gazes brilliantly upon me out of the eyes of the flowers. I was going to pick flowers. Now I leave them all standing and walk home, an old man. Quite arresting. And this is really more or less opened at random. These are complete poems of Kathleen Raine. And if you don't know Kathleen Raine's work, then do order some poetry by Kathleen Raine. I knew her quite well. I used to go and have some moments of enchantment, drinking tea in Paulton Square and eating her cake. She would always make a cake for those who came for tea. So here's the hyacinth. Time opens in a flower of bells, the mysteries of its hidden bed, the altar of the ageless cells whose generations never have been dead. So flower angels from the holy head, so on the wand of darkness bright worlds hang. Love laid the elements at the vital root, unhindered out of love these flowers spring. The breath of life shapes darkness into leaves. Each newborn cell drinks from the star-filled well, the dark milk of the sky's peace. The hyacinth springs on a dark star. I see eternity give place to love. It is the world unfolding into flower, the rose of life, the lily and the dove.
Wow.
Beautiful poem.
Very beautiful.
And it just reminds me of, I haven't opened this book for several months. So I commend to you the poems of Kathleen Raine. And I'm very much looking forward to reading your next book.
Thank you.
Patrick. And I'd just like to thank you again and thank everybody for coming, and thank Andrew and Jerome for the technical backup.
Yes. Here, here. Thank you very much, David, and thank you, everybody. Enjoyed it most.